All right, since I prepare something, I will be reading from what I have prepared, and we can just take notes, anything of interest, and we can discuss it later. And anybody can answer a question if they know more than I do on a particular issue, because the way I like to think about these lectures and even any piece of writing that I do is I'm not an authority more than I am somebody who's interested in opening up a conversation. So this is a conversation opener, and anybody who knows more than I do in certain areas is more than welcome to come in and educate all of us. I'd be extremely grateful for that. Okay, so I will read now. As I had mentioned at the beginning, this lecture comes off as an offshoot of a piece of writing in a larger body of work that I have been researching, focusing on Black subject formation and the question of freedom. In other words, focusing on the systematic process over time of changing the status of Africans to Blacks. Africans denoting self-sustaining and independent subjectivity, as opposed to Blackness, which denotes a status of dependence constructed by and for whites. So, in other words, I'm making an argument that before white settler colonialism in the continent, there were no such things as Black people. Africans did not relate to each other as Black people, and they didn't refer to each other as Black people because Blackness from inception is a political identity that is created as a subjectivity for the white population that gets to settle. Okay, so then the rest of the investigation is interested in considerations around the question of freedom for a people who are constructed as Blacks. In other words, is it possible for Black people in this world to achieve freedom, or is freedom going to be something that is forever elusive? Now, as I said, this is part of a longer piece. So within the context of today, we might not be able to get to the last question, but it is an important question for all of us to think about. So a week ago, on this Sunday, the 19th of June, I casually mentioned to a dear friend that it is the 109th anniversary of the infamous 1913 Land Act. I just finished a piece of writing on the South African Native National Congress, the organization founded in 1912 that would be renamed as the ANC in 1923. And today it is South Africa's governing party, or as our parents called it, Mandela's party. In the reading of the founders of the South African Native National Congress, it becomes immediately clear that these men were educated through missionary schools. To fully appreciate the meaning of this missionary education on the founders of the SANNC, it is better to appreciate the SANNC in full character to therefore make sense of its political actions. European Christian missionaries had been active in the land called South Africa for a couple of centuries, but it wasn't until the 1820s and onwards that missionaries were to play this decisive a role within the larger European imperial project in South Africa. From the second half of the 19th century onwards, missionaries had thoroughly established themselves as colonial wars of conquest by white settlers against indigenous polities had advanced. The conversion of natives to Christianity from what they called barbarism or heathens, or to give it its proper South African meaning, a land of non-believers known as Kafirs. Part of the colonial strategy to prevent future wars was to conquer the minds of the young amongst the Kafirs and make them believers in Christianity as a marker of them being civilized. And they were to be transplanted or implanted with British ideals and mannerisms. It is this background upon which the founders of the South African Native National Congress are born. It is also important to note that the devastation of colonial wars had been so violently brutal that entire populations of native people were profoundly traumatized and terrorized by white settler militaries and police. The leaders of the South African Native National Congress are part of these natives that are traumatized and terrified of white settlers. And for them, it is also quite at an intimate level, as many of them had missionaries as school teachers and headmasters at a time when there were eloquent proverbs of physical punishment as disciplining for a child. So these children, raised by missionaries, grew into adults. And these adults were missionary educated, and half of them went to universities in the United States and Europe, and they were distinguished gentlemen of stature and social standing. Many of them had believed, as they were told, that they are British subjects because they belonged to the British Empire, and upon fulfillment of their progress as a race, they would be accorded the full citizen rights, and they would have reached this full stage of development and maturation. And all of them believed this, it would seem, but some of them had a keen sense of being Pan-Africanists, as we can see this in Dube, we can see this in Seme, and many of the other leaders of the Congress. But even with the Pan-Africanism, there was no doubting that the ideals and the ideas of being British subjects had thoroughly permeated their consciousness. I'm going to read several quotes from leaders of the South African Native National Congress to demonstrate this point. President John Langalibalele Dube is the inaugural president of the South African Native National Congress, and he was invited to come and give an address at the 7th General Missionary Conference of South Africa in 1928. The address reads as follows, and I quote Dube here. "It is with a full sense of responsibility, then, that I say the thinking native has nothing but gratitude for the benefits conferred on us by the white man's civilization, and particularly for the word of life so diligently preached to us by that much criticized person, the missionary, our benefactor. Let me say further that I give place to no one in my loyalty than our British sovereign, who, by the grace of God, is the mightiest monarch on earth. It was unspeakable joy to see the king's heir among us a year ago, and a great moment in my life when I was called upon to extend publicly to the Prince of Wales a welcome from the natives of Natal. I am a firm believer in constitutional government, in the maintenance of peace and order, in the furtherance of goodwill among men." End quote. The second president of the South African Native National Congress, Sefako Makgatho, also made a similar statement. His was on the occasion of South Africa declaring its support for the British in the so-called First World War. And these are the words: "Before the throne of King George, for he is our king as well as yours, we do live under the Union Jack, and we are proud of it. And we are ready to fight for it today as any white man in the land." End quote. Such declarations by the leaders of the South African Native National Congress are quite common, as they assumed that their loyalty to the British Crown will lead to their deliverance here at home when poorly treated by the local white settlers. The local picture in South Africa was somewhat complicated for at least two reasons. The first reason is that the Cape government in South Africa in 1872, under the leadership of John Maltino, had successfully made appeals to Britain that the Cape should be entrusted with the responsibilities of governments under what was called responsible government, which meant that the whites in South Africa can have more local control over local affairs in South Africa. All of this was on paper, as cooperation with Britain was frequent, and Britain would always intervene in South African domestic affairs by deploying certain officials to head specific projects in South Africa, and even in some instances, prime ministers. So the British involvement was still strong, but there was also a growing local sense that South Africa needs to govern its own affairs. The second reason that complicates the picture of South Africa being a British colony, especially at the time that the SANNC emerges, is that South Africa had just emerged out of a long brewing Second World War. Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. Some people contend that we must call this the South African War because there were Black people involved on both sides. We can have that conversation later. The two reasons are important because the 1900s mark the end of the Victorian era. As Victoria dies in 1901, the global scale is shifting against Britain, which is one of the reasons why Britain has to go to the war at the level of its continental and international affairs. So emerging out of the Second Anglo-Boer War under the leadership of Alfred Milner, the administration got into post-war negotiations to craft the future in the era known as Reconstruction. From 1902 to 1910, white South Africans were involved in conversations with each other on both sides on the future of South Africa. They established in 1903 to 1905 the South African Native Affairs Commission, and its task was to provide comprehensive solutions to the native question, which had been the central question in South African politics all throughout. These two white groups, the English and the Afrikaners, after signing a treaty of Vereniging, made an important resolution of dissolving the four parliaments in the four republics of the Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. And after that, they established one parliament under an entity called South Africa. This act was called the Act of Union, or the South Africa Act, which was passed by the British Parliament, but gave South Africa its legal status, and it gained more autonomy over local affairs, which firmly also included the native question. All in the while, Black political formations in South Africa were organizing under the banner of the South African Native Convention, which vehemently opposed the Act of Union, as they feared that local whites would utilize this new independence from Britain to further disenfranchise Black people. They felt that Britain still had an important role to play as checks and balances for local whites. So in 1909, the South African Native Convention sent a deputation of 9 men to England to make an appeal against the Act of Union. It is said that they were received warmly in Britain, but nothing concrete came out of this delegation's work, as the British Parliament continued to vote for the Act of Union. So the Act of Union created South Africa as a legal entity in 1910. And the Union had its 3 headquarters, one in the Union Buildings in South Africa, Union Buildings meaning the union of these 2 entities. And its legislative headquarters were in Cape Town, where Parliament is, and the judicial headquarters were in Bloemfontein. The Union of South Africa had a new flag, and this flag was also symbolizing this unity. The currency of South Africa was still the British sterling, but a nod was given to local whites to have more autonomy over domestic affairs, as I said. Under the new administration, there had to be prioritization of reconstructing the country. South Africa had just emerged out of the Anglo-Boer War, and they passed laws to facilitate the rapid reconstruction of South Africa. So in 1911, a year after Union, they passed an important law called the Mine and Works Act, which sought to get white men employed en masse in the mines and in public works in order to improve your average household income for white families, as well as to rebuild the economy and enlarge the consumer base. However, white workers were still unwilling to do certain work, and when they did agree, it was often on their terms, and they demanded typically higher wages, and they did not want to be supervised by a black person as part of their conditions. So then the union could not, or perhaps chose not to afford the terms of the white working class, so they sought to increase black labor in the mines, specifically in those jobs where whites did not want to do. And this formed the blueprint of all industries in South Africa. The Chamber of Mines agreed to fix the cost of black wages across generations, while the income for white workers increased, which effectively meant that black workers in real terms were getting poorer while they were in jobs because their salaries were not adjusted for inflation, which meant that a black grandfather earned more than his son and grandson. And it was not uncommon in those days to have generations of black families working in the mines because the grandfather would recommend their son when their retirement age comes, and their son would recommend their son when retirement age comes. And there was a certain level of trust that was established between these families and these white managers on the farms. So the black household income did not increase for at least 3 generations. And this is crucial. So while the Mine and Works Act was trying to get black South Africans onto the mines, they realized that a lot of the black people were still heavily active in South Africa's old economy of agriculture. Black people were also the backbone of agriculture as workers from the days of slavery pre the 1834 abolition. The goal of the Chamber of Mines was clear: remove the blacks off the land so that they are available as labor in the mines. The interest from the mostly English-controlled mines merged perfectly with Afrikaner interests that had always had more invested in agriculture, as they also needed to get rid of black people from the land so that they can make more profits for themselves. At this point, and this is vital, a lot of the land had been dispossessed from black people, but a new law was necessary to codify and fix this dispossession. And this is how the 1913 Land Act was born. It squeezed black people, who were the majority of the population, to a mere 7% of the land. And the rest of the 93% of the most arable land in the country was exclusively kept for whites. In opposition of these moves, the South African Native National Congress, formed in 1912, out of the realization that the South African Native Convention was meeting too infrequently for it to address the needs of Black people. So the South African Native National Congress was formed in order to fill in this gap, to organize on a permanent basis for the interests of Black people. The South African Native National Congress followed particular techniques of sending deputations to England to appeal, as they did with the 1913 Land Act. In 1913, the Congress busied itself by collecting several cases to make its argument when it goes to Britain, but also to the South African white public, which was thought of at the time to be largely ignorant of what its government was doing. And the belief by the South African Native National Congress is that if they managed to convince and demonstrate of the laws that are being passed by the white government, that white South Africans would intercede on their behalf and make a case for them as well for a common humanity. They had, in all of this time, a sworn loyalty to Britain. And on a few occasions, they even offered to go to war against Germany in modern-day Namibia as a way of demonstrating their loyalty to Britain, but also in the hope that upon their return, they will have more bargaining power. Of course, these attempts were turned down on the basis that it cannot be allowed that a native would kill a white man, even in war, even when that white man is an enemy. So the Congress went across the country instead to collect data that was presented in Sol Plaatje's book that we know as Native Life in South Africa, but a less known text, which comes earlier than the Sol Plaatje text, is the one that is compiled by Richard Mcinziba. And Richard Mcinziba worked very closely with Plaatje to collect this book, and it emerges out of research done in only 2 provinces, not all of them. And as I had said at the beginning, in these 2 provinces alone, they were able to gather more than 500,000 cases. And so I'm going to read some cases from this particular book by Mcinziba. The title is called the Natives Land Act of 1913, Specific Cases of Eviction and Hardships. And the reason they wrote this particular text is also a charge against what the white government was saying to them. And I will quote this. They say that for immediate purposes and object of compiling together few instances, for there are comparatively very few of actual cases of hardships under the Natives Land Act. And we want to vindicate the leaders of the South African Native National Congress from the gross imputation by the Native Affairs Department, which claims that we make wild statements of existing hardships and fail to provide concrete facts. This is something that terribly bothered the men of the Native Congress because they did consider themselves to be men of integrity and men of stature. So they went about to collect these cases. A lot of these cases were brought to the president of the Congress, President Dube, and personally, he had collected about 80 cases in KZN of people who were directly evicted by the government. And when these cases were sent to the court in Pietermaritzburg, which was the capital at the time, these people were told to have been falsifying their information to their faces. So the Native Congress then decided to compile these across the country. And they've identified several trends of what happened with the people who were part of these cases. One of these trends was that people were basically forced to work as unpaid labor. They weren't calling it slavery at this time, but they were calling it labor conditions or unpaid labor. Remember, at this time, slavery had formally been abolished in 1834, as I had mentioned. So they could not call it slavery, but it is something as close to it as one can possibly imagine. So they were forced to work as unpaid serfs on the land. And one of the things that they are saying here, that Msimang, is that the evictions are being deliberately made with the sole intention of getting forced labor, as provided in the Act. White farmers know fully well that since the Act, natives are no longer free to obtain land or to make terms for occupation of land. And a lot of the times people received notices that were 6 months, if you were lucky. Some people received notices of 10 days, and several cases, people were warned to pack up everything that they had and leave within 1 hour. So I have here several cases that I'm going to share with you. The first one is the case of a chief in the Ladysmith district known as Chief Sibisi. Chief Sibisi, I'm going to read directly from the text now. It says, the chief on his own behalf and that of his people, immediately on receipt of the notices of eviction, appealed to the magistrate in Ladysmith, who, though himself sympathetic, could do nothing. The result is that Chief Sibisi and his people must clear out from these farms and find other places. Those who will remain will only stay under labor conditions. The chief is thus forced to separate himself from his people, with whom he and his grandfathers have lived for generations past. They cannot get a farm to which they can relocate as a group. He is trying and has tried very hard to find a place for himself and his people. So in the case of Chief Sibisi, in summary, what ended up happening is that that chiefdom effectively disappeared from existence because people could no longer follow a chief who did not have land for them to settle on. And they were being forced to work under what they call labor conditions. And the chief himself would have become a serf had it not been for the offer that the magistrate made to him only, that he needs to leave his people behind and he will be taken care of personally as the chief. Sibisi did refuse this. It's written on record, so we don't know what happened to him after that. The other case that is of particular interest to me in the archive is a case of Chief Mbekwa of Matwane's Kop. And in his letter, he appeals to the magistrates and through him to the chief native commissioner, but to no purpose at all. These families who have lived in this farm for generations have to quit their ancestral homes and surroundings. No native has any hope of being granted any land. Their minds are greatly disturbed, especially when they see that even their chiefs are being dealt with so slightingly by the authorities. And in this particular case, the clans that were dominant there with the surnames were the Chabalalas and the Kumetes. And of particular interest, I'll just read 3 names and I'll focus on one. The first was Matamza Chabalala, who had 5 cattle, 100 goats, and 2 horses. And then there was Mbondo Chabalala, who had 4 cattle, who had 100 goats and 4 horses. And of particular interest to me is Mr. Ngendu Gumede, who had 2 cattle, who had 80 goats and 80 horses. And on this particular case, I paused. As I mentioned yesterday, it is astounding for me to think about what it means to own 80 horses. And the more I think about this, the more I realize that anybody who owns 80 horses is a wealthy person across all human generations. All human generations. Nobody who would own 80 horses would be considered poor in any epoch of human history. So in my mind, I was struggling to fathom how this black man had 80 horses and lost all of them as a result of this, especially when one thinks about the maintenance costs of owning a horse, because horses require a lot of land, the infrastructure that they require in stables, in fencing, and a whole other range of things makes keeping horses incredibly expensive. But Mr. Gumede clearly had the means to maintain these horses, as he did until they were forcefully taken from them. And this case of Mr. Gumede is of particular interest and is something that I would like to visit. But that is the KZN side. I'll try to summarize because I want us to move to the Free State cases, and then we'll come back and conclude. In the Free State cases, the one case that was particularly outstanding was the case of Simon Diadia. But before I get to the case of Mr. Simon Diadia, I'd like to mention that one of the things that did happen in the case of the Orange Free State is that a lot of people migrated to Lesotho. A lot of people crossed the border to go to Botswana, and some people went missing. There are about 90 people who are termed in the text whereabouts unknown, about 90 people. And one of the other things that were common at that time is that people did not have just one house with one roof only. A lot of these people had many houses. In fact, when I was counting in the one case of about 55 names or 55 families, only 11 people had one home, like with one roof. The rest of the people had 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and even in one case, 9 houses. So if we think about these as real estate, if we think about these as property, then again, if we have to measure what was at a loss here, we're talking huge numbers. So in the case of Mr. Simon Diadia, Mr. Simon Diadia had worked in different farms and kept on being evicted. And his evictions, sorry, is someone speaking? Okay. In the case of Mr. Diadia, who had been moving from one farm to the other, he was struggling because the farmers that whose land he was using as a sharecropper wanted to have access to his cattle, and he refused to have this. And on 2 occasions, they basically deceived him. In the one case, the white farmer opened up the gates and made sure that his cattle, as the white farmer, completely ravaged the crops that Mr. Diadia was growing. So Mr. Diadia lost all the food supply that he had for that year with this particular act by this white farmer. And when he complained to him, he was given an eviction notice, and in which he left because he would still not agree for him to use his livestock. So Mr. Diadia thought he had found someone better when he found a widow, and she gave him license to farm, but she also insisted on using his cattle and his other animals. And he also refused. The tension that was brewing there as well. In the case of Mr. Diadia, in one of the instances, he mentions here that he had 10 children, 6 of whom were boys and 4 were girls. And they had worked for 11 months on this farm without any wages to his children nor to himself. And the farmer, in fact, complained that one of his daughters is lazy and took it upon himself to call the police on this lazy daughter. And when the policeman arrived, he went to Mr. Diadia straight, and he told Mr. Diadia that he had already heard from the owner of the farm that he, Mr. Diadia, is a cheeky native because he can read and he can write and because he has property, and that the policeman would put him right or would put him in his place, so to speak. So he then called the daughter in front of Mr. Diadia, and when she came through, he shamboked her. To shambok someone, for those who are not South Africans, it is to beat someone up with a whip. And when he beat up Mr. Diadia's daughter, Mr. Diadia jumped in defense of his daughter and grabbed the policeman by his breast and threw him down. The policeman stood up. He didn't do anything to Mr. Diadia. He went away. The following day, though, Mr. Diadia received an eviction notice from his farmer, and then he had to leave that farm as well. Long story short, in the last farm that Mr. Diadia ends up in, he disagrees with the farmer again to use his oxen. But he says here that the end result was that I had to choose whether to go or to keep quiet. I was tired of moving about from place to place, so I kept still. The consequence is now that she being the white widow, the consequence is that now she is using my oxen and wagon anytime, whenever she wants. I do not receive anything from this compensation. My children and I also work and receive no pay. So Mr. Diadia, in other words, eventually caved in and became what they called labor, forced labor. So what used to happen when you were forced labor is that you would effectively take the stock that you had, have it taken over by the white farmers, and you would work now with your own livestock, but now as part of the means of production for someone else's farming produce. And again, it would be interesting for us to do detailed studies in the modern day using language that has been developed in fields like psychology, for instance, and try to describe in some exact terms the conditions under which people went through if you had 50 cattle today and tomorrow you don't have the 50 cattle, but you can see your 50 cattle right in front of you because you have to milk it and bring the pint of milk into the house for a white farmer who did not have any of the assets that they are now acquiring as a result of subjugating you under this law. It's interesting to study these in detail. I'll say, I'll leave this part of the South African, oh no, maybe I shouldn't. The part of the South African Constitution, I'll put it in summary in the interest of time, is that as it stands, the South African Constitution holds that in order for you to qualify for land restitution, you need to have been dispossessed from the 19th of June, 1913 onwards. The reason why this is the case is that South Africa legally existed as an entity only in 1910. In other words, when the National Party was having the negotiations for democracy in South Africa, CODESA, one of their bargaining chips is that you cannot claim the lands before 1913 from South Africa, because there was no South Africa to speak of in 1930, before 1910, because it was these 4 colonies. And whatever happened before then is null and void. You basically need to start paying attention to only what happens from 1910 onwards. So since the 1913 Land Act happens after 1910, this is why in South African discourse around land, the 1913 gets to have such a pivotal place. But as I had mentioned, there were many acts before the 1913 Land Act which dispossessed Black people for a while. And there also have been a series of wars in South Africa which dispossessed Black people at a much more rapid pace than these laws did. And in many of the instances, these laws, for instance, there was an Occupation Act of 1886. And in this act, I'll give a very brief summary. The effect of it was that they took about 112,000 hectares and gave it to 160 new white farmers. And on average, this means that each white farmer got 700 hectares of land. In another act that they passed, there was a similar effect, only that this time it was 210 farms that were covering an area of 168,000 hectares, which was given to these white farmers. And in this, if you divide the total hectares with the number of farms, it gives you 803 hectares per farm. And a lot of South Africans will know that this is not a ridiculous estimation, because when you drive in the countryside in South Africa, you can be covered by farming lands on both sides of the road for stretches and stretches of road. And some of these were the farms which were acquired under these laws, which long predate the 1913 Land Act. So in other words, the justice that is likely to be born out of the current constitution, which only recognizes the South African Act from 1910, it's bound to give a stillborn justice to a lot of the people in South Africa. And this is not mere political rhetoric. We can show this in the record that a lot of the land was already taken by 1913. In fact, and this I'll close here, that in 1813, there were virtually no Black South Africans who were working or looking for jobs. This thing of employment was unknown to people in 1813 because we were self-determining to a large degree. In 1913, 100 years later, a considerable amount of Black South Africans were now being forced to get into jobs, into employment. As I mentioned, the 1911 Act was passed. But still, the majority of people could still hold off on their own, as they still had a lot of land and they still had a lot of cattle. But in 2013, 100 years later, still, virtually all Black South Africans are now described in relation to their position in the job market as either employed or unemployed. And as the numbers stand currently, they do not look good. So just to think about what it means from 1813 to 2013 and totally change the subjectivity of an entire people is a status of what we have in South Africa at the moment. And the Constitution as it stands, even if the ANC was on the right track, is not going to afford us the kind of justice that is required. And in those words, I would like to end so that we can start our conversation or the discussion. Thank you. people who are shy to ask questions can type them in the chat box. You can put up your hand. You know how this thing works.
Are you noting the hands, Rasta?
It looks like Rasta is sleeping. You are noted, Lubabalo,
No,
and Milanda.
I muted myself. I muted myself. So I'm noting the hands, Luba. Milanda, please go first.
Okay, this is not Milanda, but this is Lwazi. My question is concerning the analysis of the raw areas, and especially concerning the peasantry in the raw areas. So OMGov does an analysis in the Peasants' Revolt, South Africa, and the Peasants' Revolt on the Transkei dispensation, pre-colonial and post-colonial analysis of the distribution and disposition of people. He makes a very interesting analysis about the imposition of traditional leaders by the settler colonial state in order for them to benefit from the customary and traditional systems at play. So can you please enlighten us concerning how that system itself still plays a role today, in particular how the government and the state treats traditional leadership and the legitimacy of said traditional leadership in the contemporary context within Southern Africa and South Africa in particular. Thank you very much for an interesting and very informative presentation. Thank you, Comrade Sabelo.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so in the chat box, just to remind myself, I've written the Nhlapo Commission and Mamdani. And thanks for mentioning Gov's book, The Peasants' Revolt. And that book is also a good companion to that book is a book also by Colin Bandi. And they both write, you know, in and around the same area. And Bandi's argument is that before the 1913 Land Act, the black sharecroppers were not only matching, but they were outperforming the white farmers. And there was incredible self-sustainability on the part of black farmers. So the destruction, therefore, was a very fundamental one. And as you said, that some of the royal people were co-opted, but some of them who weren't co-opted, like Sibisi, as I had mentioned, would be completely disposed. And very often they would pick people that they like to be the ones who are going to be chiefs. So there are people who are not of quote unquote royal blood who now sit as chiefs of different nations within or different sub-nations within South Africa. And this is a hotly contested issue that is still ongoing to this very day. And the Nhlapo Commission did work to establish the veracity of each of these houses' claims to chiefdom, on kingdom, and all of the other royal attachments. And many people were delegitimized by the Nhlapo Commission, and many have subsequently challenged the Nhlapo Commission. And again, these are still ongoing tensions, because in South Africa, and the point that Mamdani makes is also a similar one, that they were forming these stratified worlds between the urban and the rural, and the despotic chiefs that were in charge of the rural side were people who very much governed with the endorsement of the white system. I mean, in South Africa, the issue of customary law is so contested that in actual truth, very few of us would be able to detail where the neat line begins between customary law and colonial law, because some of the customary law is actually influenced by colonists. Someone like Theo, what's the guy, KZN guy, Shepstone directly influenced traditional Zulu law, and a lot of Zulu people considered Shepstone as one of their, they deferred to him in terms of authority because they understood what he came with. So we have a lot to deal with when it comes to traditional authorities and the question that you have posed. But you're absolutely right. Omgov makes this point very clearly in the Peasants' Revolt, and so does Colin Bundy. And Mamdani is very instructive as well in thinking about this question, as well as the Nhlapo Commission and all the issues around that. So I hope I've spoken to that question. There are other questions and comments, and I'll come to them in a little bit. Micha, you can shoot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sabelo, for this wonderful work that you have done. My question is probably not directed to what you were saying, but I just want to know if you have come across any material that talks about societies that have gone through similar calamities that have been able to successfully transition psychologically, materially, spiritually from that dispossession to at least something that they are able to look at themselves in the mirror and be happy with what they would have transitioned into. That's my question.
Yeah, and the short answer is no, because of all the cases that I can think of, and people are welcome to jump in here with examples. The first thing that popped in my mind was Haiti. The other country that came to my mind was India. But none of these countries really have transcended white supremacy, because even though Haiti won the Haitian Revolution, what immediately happened after is that they had to sign to agree to pay for the loss of property, and the property was slaves. So in other words, they had to pay the French for losing their property, i.e. themselves, in their liberation for freedom. And we can just take a look at Haiti today and how over 200 years, Haiti has not recovered from the historic debt that they have from that time, and the betrayal to Saint Louverture, and the infightings and everything that has happened with Haitian leaders from that time till now. So Haiti is not a good example. India is not a good example either. So I really can't think of a society that has successfully transcended colonialism. I can't think of it, either materially or mentally. I know some people will mention the case of South Korea and Ghana. People love this example, but there's a fault here, because South Korea basically becomes an American proxy in Asia, and they do America's bidding, and they become effectively a capitalist state within an Asia that at the time at least was largely communist or communistic. And so that's not a perfect example, because it's a proxy state, Singapore is also a similar situation that people will mention. So in terms of actually overcoming and becoming, no, nothing comes to mind. Nothing comes to mind. People are welcome to come with other countries and we can dissect if those countries truly transcended. I'll take another question. Luba, I'm going to discriminate. It's positive discrimination. I'll take cities.
Okay, hi everyone. Am I audible?
Harud.
Yes, you are audible. We can hear
Hi,
you.
everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay, awesome. Sorry, I'm at a dance tournament, so I took a break. My name is Mcinziba, and I was born in the Free State, right? In a small town called Tabanchu. So I was raised by my great-grandmother, who was born in 1912. So as a youngster, my great-grandmother used to tell me stories of how her family was forcefully removed from the Verkeerdevlei and Brandfort areas in the Free State, and she was forced to work for a Dutch family for the longest time. Now, this lecture for me is not necessarily about, yes, I get the big picture, I get the general overview of the whole thing, right? But this is a personal one for me because even before 1912, before my great-grandmother was born, speaking to what Sabelo said earlier, there were instances where land was grabbed, you know, and I want to go as far back as that to go and get my own, you know. So I guess what I would like to know is, I mean, it was partially addressed on the Facebook platform yesterday, but I still want to know how Mutsidisi in 2022 can go back to that very racist small town called Verkeerdevlei, where my great-grandfather was buried. My great-grandmother did not have access to his grave. I would like to go back there and get what's mine. So where would I start? Because all I have is oral history. My great-grandmother did not leave any written records behind. What would be my point of departure? Like, I want a practical step-by-step thing so I can go so I can know who I must dudula when I get that site.
I almost want to say, let's take this offline because it's going to require a lot in terms of, yeah, like what's technically required. But Luba had shared a post earlier about the timelines of the land claims process, and you are now well outside of that land claims process. So the assistance that you'd have to require would be a very, very difficult one. I do have a friend who works with these cases, and I'm not sure what can be done for your particular case, but she would be best to advise on your particular case. But I think, Luba, before you start with your question or comment, can you also speak to the part that Mutsidisi is raising with regards to gaining access to the grandfather's grave and use that as a claim of having been there and try to get some justice for the family? Luba?
Yes, Rasta, thanks. And good evening to everyone who's here. The short answer to Mutsidis is that legislatively, chances of her claiming the land back are very limited. Maybe I should give a bit of background. You referred to the poster you made earlier. From 1994, one of the first pieces of legislation that the ANC passed was the Restitution of Land Act. And that piece of law opened up opportunities for people who were dispossessed of the land from 1913 up until 1994 to claim back that land. Now, there are three ways that the government can settle land restitution claims. It's either the first one is to purchase the land back and give it back to those who were dispossessed. The second one is if it is impossible for people to go back to the land from which they were removed, then the government could give them an alternative piece of land. And the last one is through financial compensation. That process was opened from 1994 up until the 31st of December, 1998. At the end of December 1998, there were about 80,000 land claims that were lodged at the Commission for the Restitution of Land Rights. Up to this day, the government has not resolved all those claims. I think there are about just over 6,000 land claims still outstanding. But now, more specifically in relation to the question that Mcinziba raised, is that Jacob Zuma's administration opened up another process for land claims in 2014 through making amendments to the Restitution of Land Rights Act. And that was meant to open again an opportunity for people who missed the 1998 deadline to lodge their land claims between 2014 and 2019. But some civil society organizations went to court, and the court declared that piece of legislation unconstitutional. They asked the department to shelve all the land claims that had been submitted by then. I think there were about 197,000 land claims that had been submitted by 2016, if I'm not mistaken, through the second round of land claims. That those must be shelved until all the claims that were lodged in 1998 had been resolved. To this day, all those claims have not been resolved as yet. So there are still 197,000 new land claims lodged between 2014 and the day that the Constitutional Court stopped the second round of land claims. I think it was 2016, I'm just not sure. So as of now, then there are no new land claims that are allowed. The ANC tried to table another Restitution Amendment Act, but that did not go anywhere. So the long answer to Mcinziba is what I've given. There are no legislative provisions as of now to provide for new land claims. People who need land now, what they can do is perhaps approach the department through their land redistribution program, a program called the Proactive Land Acquisition Strategy, wherein they buy land, and then people who need that land for productive purposes can lease the land from the government. That's the long answer to a very short question. I don't know then, Rasta, if you want me to go to the issues I wanted to raise earlier. May I?
Go ahead, Luke. Go ahead. Yeah.
Now, I just wanted to re-emphasize the issue you made when you concluded your presentation. And I see comrades are making comments about the role of religion after 1913. What actually happened from 1813 rather to 1913 is that British took over the control of South Africa from Batavian control in 1806. You know, historically, they took South Africa control of the Cape in 1875, left it to Batavian, gave it over to Batavian control again in 1803, but took it again in 1806. In 1813, the governor of the Cape at that time was John Cradock, who made a proclamation that did away with the system of loan farms that had been in place since the Dutch arrived in 1652, and then introduced private titling of land, because they were of the view that land that was not owned privately by those who use it was basically useless. It made investments on the land difficult. So from 1813, John Cradock introduced private titling of land. And you would know, and some would know, the 1820 British settlers that they called around 1820 all the poor people in Britain to come to South Africa because there was ample land for British people here. And when those people came, they were given vast pieces of land from the wars that took place. The first war actually that the British fought here was from 1811 with Amaxhosa in the Eastern Cape. And that was the fourth war in total that was fought by people from that side of the world. But what they did was to introduce the private titling of land that consolidated more and more land in the hands of the few. That combined with the wars that were fought over that period ensured that by 1813, basically, there was very little land to speak of that was in the hands of the natives. Sol Plaatje, in his book, bemoans the fact that the Union government was introducing through the Natives Land Act of 1913 the land laws of the Free State, for instance. Now, I told you that I haven't spent much time studying what those laws were in the Free State, but we know in the Cape and perhaps in the Natal, natives had very little land to speak of. If Sol Plaatje would claim that the Natives Land Act introduced to the rest of the Union natives laws of the Free State, it would mean basically that there were no natives across the country who had any land to speak of by 1913. What the Act did, you made reference to Governor Mbeki and to Colin Bundy, was to consolidate through legislation all the dispossession that had happened prior to 1913. Natives had been allowed to rent land out from whites and to be sharecroppers and to be labor tenants. The 1913 Land Act said that in areas not designated for native settlement, natives can only be present if they were providing labor, not as anything else. That's why people who were doing sharecropping, were labor tenants, and were renting land were kicked out from 1913. So I just wanted to emphasize those points.
Thanks, Luba. And I just wrote in the comments that the Germans also benefited quite handsomely. There are several towns in the Eastern Cape called, named after German cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and others. And these were given to young former German soldiers who had fought with Britain in the Crimean War. So if you would go fight for Britain, or if you would pay allegiance to Britain in particular ways and you go to war with them, they would reward you. And so the reward of these German soldiers, former soldiers, were for them to be resettled in South Africa as farmers. So a lot of the farms in the Eastern Cape are owned by these German descendants. But in South Africa, our obsession with poor classifications, even around this notion that we're so preoccupied with of race, means that we have two groups in South Africa. You're either English or you are Afrikaner, which is often assumed to be Dutch, and it isn't. The majority of Afrikaners aren't even Dutch. aren't even of Dutch descent. So there are Germans in there. Irish people are a bit of an interesting combination, but they are also part of the group of settlers in South Africa. The Scottish were very also much present. And somebody had asked about religion from 1813 to 1819. It is of fundamental importance. Religion from 1813 onwards, it was really after the 1820s, as Luba was saying, when they established churches. And again, I'm going to try to summarize a very long and complicated history, but the condition for you to attend school as a native person was that you had to be baptized and be a Christian. You would not be allowed to attend school if you had not converted to Christianity. And if you did attend school, you qualified for certain jobs that the other natives did not qualify for. So your station in life would be relatively improved compared to other natives. And a lot of the guys from the South African Native National Congress are people who exactly fit in this class. But unlike others, they were at least politically conscious, and they took their political consciousness and organized. But as you can see, that even when they are politically conscious and they organize, there are still fundamental shortcomings in the way that their consciousness is built, because these missionaries had such a profound impact at that point. So religion played a massive role during that time. A lot of the Xhosa, even all of them, I've even read of a few cases amongst Bapedi, where the children of the royal households were taken away from their parents and sent to a college in Cape Town known as Zonneblom College. And these children were educated in Zonneblom College, or the way I like to think about it, they were incarcerated at Zonneblom College, and to ensure that by the time they come out of the college, their consciousness is completely permeated by British principles, and that they're so alienated from their people that they can't actually govern them, even if they were to go back. Or if they do go back, they would be there to further British ideals and not to further customary law. And this tension is also beautifully captured in a book by A.C. Jordan called Ingqumbo Yeminyanya, where a young heir to the throne is sent away to go study in Fort Hare and then comes back and is pretty much at sea insofar as his culture and customs are concerned. And the ancestors aren't happy because of these clashes between these two worlds that this young man has brought into this polity. And there are many, many other cases like Ichala Lamawele by S.E.K. Mkhayi. They also speak to this tension. So the role of religion and what it played was so important that it basically formed two kinds of natives, at least within the Xhosa polity. The natives that were known as Amaqaba and the ones that were known as Amaqoboga. And I can also go into the detail around some of this terminology and what it implies and all of these things. But there were huge disparities that were formed. I'm gonna go to the chat to see if there are any questions that we did miss. There's a question the religion one we did answer, and then the question is, what kinds of laws did they pass? Well, I think Luba has already spoken to the kinds of laws that were leading up to the 1913 Land Act. And was there a link to the Bambata Rebellion? Yes, absolutely yes. So one of the things that I'm deeply preoccupied with in South African history is the history of tax. And taxation in South Africa is directly connected to the settler regimes. For instance, one of the first major taxes that they imposed on people was the hut tax. And the hut tax was basically as follows. If you have a hut, you have to pay 14 shillings for it. Now, if you're a native of, say, Zululand, you've never heard of something called a shilling. You've never seen it, you've never touched it because it's not part of your world economy. But then the British insist that you have to pay the rent in shillings because it's the only currency that they will accept. So obviously you have to trade that which you have as value, which is cattle, for these shillings. And then you get the shillings after selling your cattle at a loss, by the way, but you'll get the shillings and then you have to give the shillings back as rent. So this idea of rent in South Africa does not exist before white settlers. So they impose this hard tax. And here's the other impact of the hard tax. Remember how I mentioned earlier that a lot of the people had 9, 8, 6, 5 houses. Under the hard tax, you could not do that anymore because for every hut that you did possess, you had to pay. So people started squeezing their families in smaller and smaller homes. And here's the twist. They gave people, the British now, they gave people who agreed to have European-styled housing a discount on the rent. So if your house was four-cornered as opposed to the round house, you would pay less because you have agreed to build in European style. The other thing that they did is that if you agreed, which you had to at this point, because this is what Christianity was insisting on, if you agreed to marry only one spouse, you would also have discounts that are attached to you. If you insist on continuing having multiple spouses, as it was common at that time, you would pay more to the state for each of the wives that you have. So that has also saw our families dwindle in quite profound ways. And so the Bambata rebellion is specifically around the issue of taxation. The other thing that every head of cattle was taxed. They even taxed dogs. You had to be taxed for every dog that you own. So anything in the control of native people had to be taxed. So Bambata had had enough of this and decided to organize a revolt to say, we're not going to pay. And they did what they did to Bambata. So a lot of the people learned, and Bambata happened in 1906, and John Langalibalele Dube, the first president of the ANC, was a full adult by 1906, and he was in the same district that Bambata's rebellion took place, and he was already a school principal at that time at Ohlange, he's the college that he founded. And he is said to have been opposing Bambata because he was concerned that children were not going to school. They were missing out on teaching because Bambata was mounting a rebellion against the British. So for Dube, it was more important that children must go to school than it was for his people to succumb to imposed taxes. Now, this is also important when you have to think about the political consciousness of the founders of the South African Native National Congress. As I said, these are people who were deeply terrified and traumatized by white brutality. Dube sees it in his own lifetime. Khobusana, for instance, is born at the tail end of the cattle killing amongst Amaxhosa in the mid-1850s. Right, so these guys grew up in extreme conditions of poverty and famine. They understand what the trauma of going through these things meant. Sifako Makhatu, for example, was a son of a chief amongst the Bapedi, and his father used to report to Sekhukhune, and both him and his father were dethroned within Makhato's own lifetime. So even Makhato's consciousness is formed by the immediate trauma he has seen of having his king and his chief, being his father, completely disposed of their political power and killed. So, and I'm saying this so that people understand what went into the consciousness of the Native Congress. And my argument is not that the South African Native National Congress or even the ANC sold out. My argument is that they bought in. And this is fundamental to understand. They bought into the idea of being British citizens. They bought into the idea that upon converting to Christianity and being gentlemen and marry one wife and live in a four-cornered house and all of these things, they would then be accorded citizenship and they can have equal representation, as they said at the time, one man, one vote, and so on and so forth, right? So they bought into this stuff, and this is what they were organizing for. So when they sent these deputations, it wasn't out of them dreaming in the wilderness. They were going there to remind Britain that these are the things that you have said to us, and the whites in South Africa are dishonoring that agreement or that promise that you gave to us. And you find this in the rhetorics of Mkhai's poetry, for instance. So that's another important dimension to make sense of. There's a comment there by Tiane that says there's also the case of Amamfengu that complicates the picture further. I was also shocked to learn in the archives that while Amaxhosa were called Kafirs, Amamfengu were being referred as Fingo. There's also the history of Amamfengu fighting on the side of the British and being rewarded with land. Absolutely. And again, Tutianta is the line of religion, to go back to Victor's question about the role of religion. So Amamfengu get into a treaty with the British in 1835. And so from 1835 onwards, Amamfengu are treated differently from the rest of Amaxhosa. And the preferential treatment of Amamfengu in those days is so much better relatively to the rest of the people of Amaxhosa that some Xhosa people converted to become Mfengu so that they get to qualify for some of the benefits that Amamfengu had, which was access to education as well as land, as Tiane said. So if you go to the Eastern Cape, amongst Amamfengu, you will find title deeds that date back to the 1800s. Black people with title deeds that go back to the 1800s against the general rule of application where Black people were dispossessed. And as I said, there are a lot of Xhosa people who converted to be Mfengu so that they qualify for these benefits. The Jabavu family, for instance, which is a prominent family in South African intellectual history at the very least, is an exemplar of this kind of tension that exists, because the Jabavus are quite clear to constantly pick the side of the whites in all the struggles that were happening at the time. And even if they were generally oppositional to some aspects of it, it came from a very different place than the rest of the natives. So Sol Plaatje, for instance, takes up a debate with Jabavu, which never happens because Jabavu basically snubs Plaatje. But Plaatje in this particular debate represents a radical side. So again, this idea that the ANC sold out falls short of historic understanding and appreciation, because from the basis of Jabavu, and there's another group that was also called the Aboriginal Protection Society, and other formations. There were formations that were more conservative than the ANC, even in 1912. There were formations that were more conservative than the ANC even later. So relative to those guys, they were somewhat left. But if we look at it objectively, they were far from being left. In fact, they were off center, a little bit to the right, until Josiah Gumede became the president of the ANC in the late 20s. And then he radicalized the ANC, and Seme took his ANC back basically when they ousted Gumede, because they were afraid that the communists had infiltrated the ANC and they were taking it away from its true character. So there were always these tensions amongst native people in relation to power. And this was deliberate all throughout, because you needed to maintain difference amongst native people in order to maintain power. There's another comment there that says, you mentioned people fleeing to Lesotho. It's worth weaving together as a history in the history of the Basotho and how they got this. Yeah, absolutely. How they got dispossessed and forced into starvation and accommodation with the British, yet retained a slightly different colonial relation compared to the Union of South Africa. Yeah. Thanks for that point, Peter. Yeah, I mean, this is twisted, right? Because you have a lot of people who are South Africans who would go to what was called Botswana land, which is Botswana. And when these people come back today, we as the modern day South Africans would call them foreigners. And there are people who fled to Lesotho who, when they want to come back today, we would call them foreigners. And they can point, like Mcinziba was saying, exactly where they stayed before, but we don't hear any of this. So there are deep divisions that were formed, but Lesotho does become a protectorate of Britain, and so does Botswana and Swaziland at that time, Eswatini today. So there are different relations to empire that are available for them that are different to those in the Union of South Africa. So that's a very important point, Peter. And we even now, like the South African hegemonic state post-94 still squeezes Lesotho. Virtually all of our water that we drink from our taps comes from Lesotho. And the bulk of the investments into Lesotho today are still around the question of water. There's like even German companies are still active in Lesotho right now, investing in the dam project. So we know too many of these cases, even at an anecdotal level, to share, but thank you for that important point. There's another comment that says the title deeds to land that many of Amamfengu emanate from was called Umhlaba weBhaso. Yes, land that was given as a reward for the role Amamfengu played in the defeat of Amaxhosa. In fact, the British would not even have won the war against the Khoi and Amaxhosa during the 8th Frontier War, were it not for Amamfengu and the Swat Battalion. Again, these are all truths, because I mean, Sekhukhune would not have been defeated, for instance, had it not been for the Swati regiment that fought with the Boers against Sekhukhune. And as Luba was saying, Amamfengu and the Swati battalion also assisted to defeat anti-colonial wars. So these histories are complicated. And just because, and I say this even with regards to the so-called Xhosa wars, it wasn't only Xhosa people who fought in these wars. These were national wars of liberation, but often the chief or whoever the leader would be a Xhosa one. But because the British would interface with that person, they would then call that a Xhosa war, when that is in fact not the case. Our people collaborated a lot, but our people also clashed a lot for varying interests, depending on what was going on at the time. So that's a very important point, Luba, and thanks for mentioning that. There's a question that says, do Amamfengu have claim to kingship in South Africa? I think Abantu base-Transkei might answer this better. Tiane, please feel free to jump in on Transkei, but in my recollection, the king, is it king or chief? It's king. The king of Amamfengu is Ufaku, or the descendants of Faku today. So they do have, to answer the question bluntly, they do have a claim to kingship in South Africa. And I think it's through Ofaku, but can someone please confirm that? Oh, thanks,
Yeah,
Luba.
well,
Tiane?
no, you're going to say. Oh, okay. No, I was just going to say, from what I've read, Not to my knowledge. I don't think it doesn't mention Amambolo, it doesn't mention Ofago. And it seems to their lineages seem to have disappeared. And it seems as though, I think Nomboniso mentioned at first, Nomboniso Kasa, that this was done on purpose. That because we're fleeing, the Mvekane wars and so on, so they hid their leaders and their chiefs and kings. But somehow it seems as though over time, these lines of leadership disappear by the time they get to what is now called the Eastern Cape. Because, I've looked closely into one community in the former Sky, Amahlati, and in their history, they clearly reject the idea of having a chieftaincy over them. And up to the point where they get to Pedi, the only thing they reference is I don't know what they call it. It's not an agreement, but it's a statement they made in some space or under a tree somewhere in Pedi, which is, I think it's a space they revisit annually, where they declare their independence.
Yeah, it's the treaty I was talking about, the 1835 treaty. It was signed under a milkwood tree. And I know this because I'm obsessed with trees, and I've done this research on the history of the milkwood tree. There are three main treaties that are important in shaping South African history that are signed under this tree. So, yeah, but you can continue, Tiani.
No, that's what I wanted to mention. But I had a question, especially for Olubabalo, even you. What turned Amamfengu against Amaxhosa, or what made it easy for them to fight on the side of the British? Because from what I've read, that point does not surface very, very well. It's not very clear. So I've always been curious, what was it about, what made Amamfengu turn against Amaxhosa? And also in your research in the archive, from what you've presented so far, we get a lot of what the so-called Amaqoboka, or the people that went to school, were thinking, and what their actions were, and what informed those actions. Does the archive give an idea of what Amaqaba were thinking, and what was their position, and how it evolved over time?
Thank you for that. Luba, you can have a stab first, and then I'll come in later.
Short thanks, Abs, and thanks, Tiani. Amamfengu, the word mfengu in Xhosa comes from ukumfenguza, which means you are a wanderer who goes around looking for assimilation. So from the wars that took place in what we now know as KZN, there were a group of people who ran away, and some of these people then came to what we now know as the Eastern Cape. In terms of clans, Dlamini, Ohadebe, I think Obele as well. So they came to the Eastern Cape. There was this saying in Xhosa when we grew up, that they bought Ubuxhosa through paying cows, that they had to pay cows in order to be accepted as part of Amaxhosa. But be that as it may, these people were always viewed as outsiders by Amaxhosa, and they were not treated very well, such that when the British came, they thought that, well, they could make things easier for them if they aligned themselves with the British against the oppression that they had faced when dealing with Amaxhosa. So I think the animosity stems from that. They were very industrious people. They were able to use advanced tools for agriculture and all of that. And that was the source of some, that was the cause of some of the animosity between them and Amaxhosa. But when the British came, they then quickly aligned themselves with the British in fighting against Amaxhosa. But what is interesting here, if I may stretch it further, is that in the eyes of the British, even though they favored Amamfengu when the wars were still hot with Amaxhosa, just after the cattle killing disaster of 1856, the British thought that they were done with Amaxhosa, they'd completely defeated them, and that they embarked on a campaign of disarming Amaxhosa and everyone who was black as well. Amamfengu thought that they were going to be immune from that disarming, but they were also disarmed. That was before the last war in 1879. So in the eyes of the British, even though the Amamfengu were their allies, but they were just black. They were black people who were not supposed to have arms that they could, on a later stage, use against white people. That's the source of the conflict as far as I'm aware. Thanks.
Thanks, Luba. And Tiana, to speak to your question, one of the things that is clear is that Amamfengu were kind of like the subaltern class when Amaxhosa were in charge of the polity, right? So when the people who are effectively your handlers are being dethroned by someone else who comes from outside, if you want to improve your station in life, you are going to side with the people who can seemingly help your cause. And this is the legal, rational explanation as to why Amamfengu sided with the British, because it was going to relieve them of some of the pressure that they were under when the Xhosa polity loomed large. So that was the legal, rational decision-making that was at play. But as Luba was saying, at the end of the day, they were still black, and it was only in relation to other black folk that they could have particular privileges. But they, at any point, they couldn't rebel. Like being Mfengu didn't protect you over and above being black, because if you were black and you were trying to organize politically and do all of these funny things, you would still be dispossessed, and you might even be stripped of your titles. So there were legal, rational decisions behind these tensions, and the reason why they sided with the British. You find similar cases even in the North, where there were these kinds of collusions. So again, it complicates a couple of ideas, but these are important questions. I like your question around Amaqaba and what Amaqaba thinking, because I spent too many years of my life trying to answer this question, because okay, so a bit of background to some people who may not be aware of these things. Amaqaba were the natives who refused to convert to Christianity, and they refused to baptize, and as a result, did not have access to schools. Remember when I said earlier that the condition for you to access the classroom was that you had to relinquish your traditional beliefs and become a Christian. So Amamfengu are the people who refused to convert, and they were symbolized by putting on the red ochre. And the word for ochre in isiXhosa is imbola, and the word to smear or to apply is ukuqaba. So amaqaba were people who used to smear ochre as a symbol of remaining true to their natal condition, whereas the ones who had converted and became amaqoboka were called amaqoboka because when they converted to Christianity, very often they would be given pins that they would put on their suits or their new garments of clothing, and they would pierce these onto the garment to show that they have now converted. We know this piercing with the ZCC church, for instance, but all these churches in South Africa have this piercing that they put on their chest. And this is where the term ukugqobhoka comes from, because they would pierce their clothes to have this pin, or ispeliti as we call it. Now, these two groups have very divergent futures from that point onwards, but there's serious tension between them. So Amakaba, they did not have access to written works, which means we have to access the archive of Amakaba very differently. In fact, the work that this requires is that we even need to reconsider what even qualifies as an archive. Because if you're going to work in the tradition of Amakaba, you have to work within the tradition of Amakaba and look at it from inside, looking in, as opposed to outside, looking in. Sorry, you have to do it from inside looking out, as opposed to outside looking in. So to give a concrete example, Tiana, when people go through Indwaso, that is a tradition. I mean, it's very, very corrupted now, but that would be a tradition that is firmly rooted in the tradition of Amakaba, because a lot of our traditional healers would be able to throw bones from different animals, and they know that if a particular bone from a particular animal falls in a particular way, this is the meaning, or this is the implication that this has for you. And that, for me, in my work, I qualify that as reading, because it is being able to read Amatambo. It is an ability to read and be able to tell something about the person. And very often people who consult with traditional healers will tell you that this person knew things at my home and whatever, like things that they couldn't have rationally known about, right? So this is a form of reading that we need to make a case for, that even in academia where we are, when we make cases for our intellectual work, we're able to draw from different archives that transcend the idea of an archive as ink on paper. We need to start thinking about how certain things like song and dance and many other things that our people did are archives. Because if you look at Ingoma Zamakaba, for instance, in war, there's a particular type of song called Amagwacho. And these songs are songs that are known and sung by soldiers in war when they are fighting against invaders. But in order for you to know this, you have to be inside. You can't know these things from the outside. So a lot of our traditions survived by protecting them through secrecy. And a similar practice that still goes on, for instance, is ulwaluko. And nayo, it's corrupted in many, many ways. But during the olden days, through circumcision, there would be things that are passed on to the children. And this is a firmly Kaba tradition, because Amakaba were proud of Waluko. When the missionaries hated it with all of their lives, it doesn't take too long. The founder of Fort Hare hated Ulwaluko so much because it took students away from Fort Hare, so much so that now Black people only go to circumcision school, Amaxhosa in particular, but even generally, during the holiday periods when whites no longer need them in school or in the factories. So this is one of the ways in which our traditions are being squeezed to fit in, and we hold on to them, albeit at a symbolic level, and we lose a lot because we're just tied up to symbolism and not the essence of why these traditions were done. So in my own work, I make an insistence that there is something called an archive of Amakaba, but we do need to change even what we think of as an archive that transcends ink and paper. But we can have this conversation, and you can read my work when it's done. It's been giving me headaches for the last decade. So hopefully it's worth the headache when I'm done. Okay, there was another comment that was saying, can we consider the formation and actions of the ANC a representation of academically and intellectually colonized Blacks, given the fact that even after attaining political freedom, they did make concessions that were neither popular nor made political sense? Let's take the acceptance of the quote unquote legal state as one of those concessions. Ooh, okay, in the record, as I've been able to demonstrate, that the consciousness of the South African native national, the native, the SANNC was thoroughly permeated by these British ideals. In that quote, for instance, you will see that Dube is talking about his belief in the common, he believes in law and order, for instance, which means very specific things if you read it in the white context. He also believes in the furtherance of goodwill among men, and Dube is proudly Christian and proudly all these. So the Blacks who were leading this stuff were likely to be the people who will forgive even when forgiveness is not being asked, because that's what their critical disposition is formed by. So the Christendom was so strong. And so by the time Mandela is born in 1918, there was already a set Congress practice. And by the time he reaches maturation, he is in fact one of the early irritations and radicals within the movement, but later on the position changes. So by the time they get to the negotiation table, the old traditions of the South African Native National Congress have also permeated into the ANC, which was very clear, as I mentioned yesterday, that even when it had a military wing, the interest in the military wing was to attack strategic points in South Africa to agitate white folk so that they pressurize their government to get to negotiations with the ANC. So at no point did Umkhonto weSizwe or the ANC think, plan, or devise a strategy of winning South Africa back through war. This was not part of their thinking, in the same way that it wasn't part of Dube's thinking when Bambata was rebelling against the whites, because as I said, they were thoroughly formed by this terror of the whites. If you look at the debates within Umkhonto weSizwe, for instance, you will see that there are two sides. There's the side that believes that we can beat the whites in war and we can take over South Africa and do what we want, basically. And there's a side that says, no, these guys are too powerful, too well-trained, they have nuclear weapons and sophisticated armory and so on, they will defeat us. Let's not fight them in war, let's go to the negotiation table. And this is an internal tension in the ANC that goes on even during the negotiations, because there were some people in the ANC who were saying, you're conceding too much too early. You're bending backwards. And there are some people who say it's okay to bend right now so that we get political freedom. And when we get political freedom, we will then use the political freedom to gain economic freedom. And we know how far that has gone up, or gone down rather. And this is why, for instance, today we have more and more South Africans who are agitating for economic freedom as opposed to political freedom, because from this vantage point of this generation, we can take political freedom for granted in ways that the older generation could not take political freedom for granted. But again, for me, there is a danger in symbolism, because a lot of the times we took our struggle for freedom to mean being able to vote. So if you give people the vote, but you're then able to capture the state economically, whatever you do politically is insignificant, because the bulk of how the economic infrastructure is set up relies on the same people who were supporting and beneficiaries of apartheid. So again, the political dispensation in South Africa was bound to do exactly what is happening right now. There's nothing that's going on right now that is an accident. A lot of people saw what was going on. They warned about it, but here we are. And then who's Tiana says sounds like it's worth the headache. Yeah. Do we have further comments? Oh, sorry, Ellison, you had your hand up. Sorry, we took so long to get to you.
Awake. Give thanks, Rasprof. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
No, really.
We can hear you.
No, can I ask you something? Can I ask everyone to unmute, please? Yeah, unmute. Can everyone just unmute? Give thanks. Aware. So, listening to what you have said, brother man, especially about what we consider archives, right? And also as a person of poetry who writes, right, who tries to archive. And these past 2 days and today has really been something so fulfilling. And there's one thing that stood out to me and I wanted to share. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Go for it.
Sure.
Oh, yes.
We are coming for everything. We are coming for the rivers, streams, oceans, seas, rainwater, boreholes. We the ones who shake the stars with our drumming. We are coming back for ourselves. We'll no longer be shaped by wicked hands, hands that break, erase, dictate. Yes, we the ones who go to Matopa mountains to face our gods. We are coming for ourselves. We are coming for everything. We are coming for the rivers, streams, oceans, seas, rainwater, boreholes, the ones who crack open the skies without drumming, chanting, rain-making, dancing. So how dare you deny us the very source that birthed us? Kiribula! Bula! Aine! Bula!
Aine.
We are coming back for ourselves. We will no longer be shaped by wicked hands. Yeah. We will no longer be shaped by wicked hands, hands that break, erase, dictate. Yes, we the ones who face God. We are coming back for the bones that are buried in sunflower fields. The dead may not speak, but they never forget. So eat the bread that's soaked in blood. Jaha, ujela hamonati na, ujela hamonati, ujela hamonati na, ujela hamonati, kiribula mlomo utwele, bula mlomo utwele, bohobe bo kimadi. So no, we can't stand the heat, so bend down the kitchen as Kitchener did with our fields, so yield and harvest from the scattered ashes. Much joy comes from a phoenix that yields from the scattered ashes. Listening for a brand new day. Oh, Africa, 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 we are coming for your coal trains that robbed us of our fathers, carriages carrying cattle, death, a constant companion. Your ways of living become your ways of dying. Your ways of living become your ways of dying. Mara, we are coming for everything. Kiribula! That's what I wanted to share. We are coming for everything. And thank you for these seminars, Prof. Ras. Give thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you. Thank you. There's nothing to say to that. I was watching a video, 30-second video earlier, but maybe I can just play it as a clip. It's only 30 seconds. And this is by South Africa's most interesting king by any stretch of the imagination, the king of Abatembu. And this is what he had to say. I hope it's going to be loud enough.
But gentlemen, I don't want to waste your time. I just want to show you how foolish. Do you know my title deed? My title deed of our farm at home. It's granted by the Queen of England. I mean, what a joke. What kind of a joke is that?
So that's the king of Abatem when he's talking about a title deed that exists now. This is a comment that he made yesterday. And so when we talk about these things, we're not just talking about, we don't love history in a vacuum. We're trying to do important work here. One, to correct history and how it was recorded, because it has serious implications for how people think about themselves, or everybody, in fact, and also what we think of as solutions to our present problems, which are rooted in history, and to understand where we come from and not to fall to repeat the same errors when we plan for the future. And this has been my investment for many, many years. And this is why I've gone to do this work of understanding our history. And it's great for history's own sake, but I think for me, it's very important to connect history to present challenges and for us to be able to see how things that were tied and formed back then still tie and bond us to this very day. So from my side, I'm done. We can hang around. People are still here in their numbers, it would seem. So the floor is really open. It's your church. So let's go for it.
I think that's a very interesting clip from The Interesting King. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I think it's very interesting, especially in relation to a question that I was asked earlier about traditional leaders and the role they played in the past and where are they right now, or what is their role at the moment. Because what strikes me about the history and the present moment is the parallels between how government or the colonial government used traditional leaders in the past for indirect rule and to interfere with the customary space and the agency of Black people, with what is happening right now, which is exactly the same thing. So it's so funny that this king is laughing at this title deed that is given or issued by the Queen of England, because what we're seeing right now, it's like they seem to be facilitating the same kind of dispossession that happened in the past. Because, if you follow a lot of cases in the rural space right now, they're striking a lot of deals with outside companies without involving the people who live on the land or who own the land without getting their consent. And so it's really funny to hear him laugh at this when actually they seem to be serving the same forces still.
Yeah. No, that's the complication of human beings, right? We all hate being oppressed as Black people, but as Black men, our investments in masculinity and patriarchy seem to be stronger because Black women's position is still quite precarious in this country. So it seems to be a universal trend across time that people are only as active as their bodily interests are concerned, because this king is able to say this because in relation to the Queen of England, he is in the powerless position or less powerful position. But when he's amongst his own people, as you said, he and all the others do take a lot of decisions without consultation and all of these things, as you perfectly said. So it seems to me that there's a historic thing here, that a lot of the times people oppose oppressors, as Fanon said, so that they can be in a position to be the ones who do the oppression. So I take your point, and I take this with a full cognizance of this pattern throughout history. So yeah. Any last comments? Anybody who hasn't spoken, who felt like we've been speaking too much, who wants to say something, please come through. Okay, no, I think that's a sign.
I can simply, Rasta, thank you for this, and add that I'm hoping that you are planning to have a series of them and on various contents. I know that you also do some other work, historic work. I've attended one, the walkabout in town where you were giving us the history of slavery. So I'm just hoping that you will also indulge us with many of these. It's quite exciting to sometimes listen to this. It's also refreshing, and yeah, it makes you think that you're not mad when you are seeing things and understanding things a little bit differently, because you give us a little bit more to think about. So I'm hoping that you are planning more, and I'd encourage that for you to also have a lot more of these and more rapidly, now that you are also done with some of the work that you were doing rather.
Yeah, no, I'm planning on dying of diabetes on a farm alone under a tree. That's my plan. I've given up on blacks will never revolt, man. I've given up. Yes, leader. I agree with that leader. Whoever the leader is who just spoke now, that's who I agree with.
As a lay minister in the Anglican Church, I'll only be too happy to bury you, my man.
Yeah. No,
but honestly, Sabs, I think this should be an ongoing series to reflect. It doesn't matter how many we are, but the circle can only grow bigger. And I think it's important that now we've dealt with the history of, with a part of the history of the land question, that maybe in the next session or sessions we'll deal with contemporary problems relating to the land question, because this is where we are now, and there's just no hope of us going any further if we are going to be sticking to the path we are in. And secondly, maybe to give you a suggestion for the next topic, in September, on the 9th of September, it will be 149 years since the death of Maqoma. I think we know how gigantic a figure he was in our history. Maybe we should be talking about how these wars have shaped us in the future, and perhaps our docility today may be a result of things that happened in the past. And the fact that you feel that there is no space for revolt today or in the future may be a consequence of things that happened in the past. So I'm just giving you maybe tips for future topics, but what I will not accept is that this is the end of it. We need to perhaps organize a series of these sessions going forward. But thanks a lot to you and to everyone who's been part of this.
Thanks, Luba. And I also wrote in the comments there that people who don't know Maqoma, just do a basic online search of who Maqoma was, and feel free to contact me and or Luba so that we can talk more about this, the organizations that we've been working with to try and keep the memory of Maqoma alive, and to raise some of the questions that come together in Maqoma. Tiana's question around Maba, for instance, is a question that I have been thinking around specifically through the figure of Maqoma, because he's one of the traditional leaders who refuses to convert to Christianity, even to the point of death. They forced him and baptized him against his will, and he rejected Christianity all the way through, because he even asked us a comment basically that says, does being Christian come with land? Because it was clear to Maqoma what the main struggle was about. And to go back to Le's point again, when we confuse the struggle to be about the ballot instead of land, we get the things that we get today in our political dispensation. Because I assure you right now that if every family had 1 hectare of land, there would be less people standing on the side of the road asking for 50 cents or asking for a piece job for an afternoon. We would be working that land and we'd be feeding ourselves to a larger extent, and we'd have other imaginations. We would even be freer. You know, there's something in my early political consciousness when whites used to ask us all the time, what do you want to do with this land? What are you going to do with this land? And we would answer them. We'd say, we just want to look at it. It doesn't matter what we want to do with it. We just want to look at it. And it's important to even just look at land, because there's something profoundly therapeutic about walking outside, standing on your stoop and have vast amount of land in front of you to look at. It's therapeutic. Nobody can tell me otherwise, as opposed to the conditions that we live in crowded townships. So the importance and vitality of land to one's mental health, to one's spiritual well-being, as Mcinziba was saying, your ancestors connected to this land, and now you can't access your great-grandfather. That means there are certain things at home that you can't do properly because certain ancestors cannot be accessed and they can't access you. So the land question for me is and will forever remain the most pivotal political question above all else. So thanks to everyone for coming through. As I said, my plan is to get myself a farm, which I will buy and finance through banks because the revolution is not coming. So I'm gonna sell out and give whites money for my stolen land. But you are welcome to come through to the farm and we can be depressed together there. And we eat some of our own organic food, and hopefully we think anew about what futures this country can have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasta.
Sure.
Thank you, Sabelo. Sabelo, but before Uambine, are you still there?
I'm here.
I mean, you made very interesting references. I'm guessing this is like a post-session conversation because you've already said bye. But you've made very interesting references to some of the prolific Xhosa writers, Umqhayi, A.C. Jordan. And, the points they seem to be making about, what the impact of education on the children of traditional leaders who are sent to these universities and institutions. I think that's very interesting because lately I've been reading, since last year I've been reading, what's his name? Witness K. Tamsang, Tembali Appeals. And it took me a while to pick up on this. But then after a couple of months of reading this, because I read one chapter like per month, I picked up on an argument, a very subtle argument that he seems to be making, that in relation to this division between Amaqaba and Amaqoboka, that it was perhaps not necessary. Perhaps a strategic position would have been for people to adopt education without actually losing who they are in terms of their identity, which for me resonated so much with what the students were calling for in RMF, you know, that an education that reflects who they are. So not so much that they were rejecting education, but actually they want an education that speaks to who they are culturally and spiritually and so on. I mean, I don't have a question, but I was just fascinated by how he seems to be presenting a different position, which is not as, you know, as stuck between you either Iqaba or Iqoboka, you know, but he seems to be saying that maybe a better position would have been to, or a strategic approach would have been to go to school, but then do not lose who you are. And I find that actually even speaks to or challenges the idea of divide and conquer, because this idea of Amaqaba and Amaqoboka is actually what that is, divide and conquer, dividing people and conquering them. But actually, if people take from both these systems or positionalities, then there is no need for, they are not divided anymore, you know?
Yeah, I'll have to have a whole new...
I'm curious. No, I'm curious. I don't have a question. Yes, comment.
No, I hear the subtle argument, right? But we also can't mount that argument as if the destruction to the tradition of Amaqaba has already happened. So that is the first part that will challenge that position. Because when we get into the space of creating a future, the past has already happened. And the past is that Amaqaba have been ridiculed. Even to this day, people who practice in one aspect or another, practices of Ubuqaba are looked at in very, you know, degrading ways. So we can't pretend that this power dynamic does not exist. So when we are going to be, a word I was hoping to avoid using, we're not going to decolonize the education system. We have more to decolonize. As I said, even the notion of what constitutes an archive is something that needs to be paid careful attention to. So now, for instance, if we say you must go to university for 3 and 4 years, are we also going to insist that you must go through Indwaso and other traditional practices for 3 and 4 years so that we can say you're a properly balanced person and then you can be a full member of society? Or are we going to say, oh, go through 18, 20 years of Western education, but don't forget who you are. Just somehow remember it, don't forget. Because I know when I walk around town and I see our brothers, even our mothers, selling certain herbs along the side of the road, like, or selling roots, I have no idea what those roots are. I couldn't tell you the difference between Indelezi and whatever else is there. I don't know them because that's not my consciousness as somebody who grew up in townships. So for me, this is an important question. And for you, I think the question I'm throwing back to think about is practically, how would we actually balance this given the fact that the history that happened that belittles the tradition of Amaqaba has already happened? And in terms of prescribing what methods we're going to use for a balanced education going forward, how are we going to do this? Are we going to say people must go through the same years of schooling in the African tradition and then go through the years of schooling in the Western tradition? Or are we going to merge these two things and see what happens? I'm open to these conversations, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there's terrible violence and attack that's already happened to the tradition of Amaqaba. I will say this though, that the Chinese are practicing something very interesting in medicine. If you go to a hospital in China, there's a side where you go to Western medication, and there's a side where you access what they call CTM, Chinese traditional medicine. And we don't have that in South African hospitals. And I know that there is work that is currently going on of recognizing traditional leaders and so on and so forth, but there are serious tensions and there's serious hierarchies. It's the same thing in law. In law, our law is a cute, nice to have, but the white people's law is the law that really counts. So if we're going to merge and bring these two things together, exactly what will that look like, given the context of centuries of oppression that have already occurred that shape the things that we have? So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I'm not even disagreeing with Thamsanqa, but I am saying let us refine that question. For me, the way Thamsanqa is currently putting it, it doesn't take into full consideration the implications of even the statement that he is making. There's a comment there that says we're planning on starting an agri estate and be giving each hectare and living off the grid. Please sign me up. I am ready. And Banele, I'm not sure he's still here. Banele is an engineer that specializes on, yeah, anyways, we'll talk about the strategy, but sign me up on that eco village. I'm in. Alrighty, Tian says there's another book called Listen to the conclusion. Yeah, no, guys, let's stop lying. But yes, Coach, I don't know if Coach is still here because I wanted to see what we're going to do with all of these things in the chat. Is there a way of saying these things in the chat so that people can go back to check the books and everything else that have been recommended?
Yeah, I'll save the chats and the recording, and then we'll find a way to distribute them.
Okay, yeah, people who are here or people who are interested in this, they can always message me, and Coach and I will find a way of making it available. Thanks everyone, have a good night, and hopefully we'll see each other soon. Bye. Coach, I'll stay behind with you just to tie things up.